What do you do if you're a professor at a leading Russian university and speaking honestly about the Putin regime brings threats of investigation and prosecution from the authorities? In 2013, Sergei Guriev chose self-exile in France after being interrogated repeatedly for criticizing the Putin administration's treatment of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, a Russian oil tycoon. Now at Sciences Po in Paris, Professor Guriev sat down with Resident Scholar Leon Aron at the American Enterprise Institute to discuss the Russian economy, the tactics of modern autocrats, and why he has no plans to return to Russia.
What do you think is happening with the Russian economy? Why? And what are the implications for the regime?
I think today Russian economy is actually facing a perfect storm in the sense that there are several headwinds that are blowing at the very same time. One being the lack of reform, the slowdown due to the bad investment climate, high corruption, intervention of the state. That slowdown and stagnation has actually started before Crimean crisis. Then on top of that, there is a low oil price. Just a year ago, nobody would have believed that oil price can go below $50 per barrel or stabilize at 60 or slowly above 60. This is something that is a dramatic event for Russian economy. And on top of that is the sanctions, the impact of the sanctions which have been introduced last year. And these things reinforce each other. If not for the sanctions, low oil price would be a problem, but a temporary problem. Russia would be able to sit out of the market or borrow. With the sanctions, Russia cannot borrow, and therefore it has to spend the reserve fund. And at the moment, if you look at the budget, at the speed at which reserve fund is being spent, the regime has a couple of years, but probably not more. In a couple of years, the regime will have to reckon which other expenditures to cut, and that may have dramatic political implications. In principle, the government is very happy to say that Russian public is ready to suffer, but I think we've not yet seen the real cuts, we've not yet seen the real hit on the economy, and once incomes go down substantially, Russian public will start to choose whether to believe the TV or the fridge, as they said in Soviet Union.
Tell me, Khodorkovsky has been pardoned by Putin, and you were harassed, maybe it's a milder term for what was happening to you, in connection presumably with the preparation for the third trial of Mikhail Khodorkovsky. With Khodorkovsky in exile but free, is there any reason for you to stay out of Russia, and what's your sense on this?
The interesting part of this story is that while Khodorkovsky has been pardoned, the case which was started in 2003 is still open. And we occasionally hear news that this case is supposed to be closed, but it's still open. And by Russian law, no case can stay open for more than 10 years. But what happens to this case, every quarter it gets renewed, it gets prolonged. And in that sense, I'm still a witness in this case, and I'm still not sure whether I can return to Russia or not. And on top of that, that's been a number of other signals that I got that I may be also disliked by the regime because I publicly supported Mr. Navalny. I may have also been disliked by the regime because I spoke reasonably openly about the imperfections of Russian political system, which is, let's put it mildly, less than democratic.
You published a very interesting article called New Authoritarianism. And the essence, as I understood it, is this. There's a new kind of authoritarianism. In other words, you don't have to kill people, you don't have to kill many people. You don't have to put many people in jail. It's enough to manipulate symbols, it's enough to manipulate information, it's enough to manipulate the truth. I assume that you feel that the current Russian regime falls into that category. Could you talk more about this?
This paper covers new regimes, not only the Russian regime, but also some other regimes, of which we think the first regime was Fujimori's government in Peru. But there are some other countries which also fit this description now around the world.
China? You mentioned China.
To some extent, Turkey, Hungary,
right.
Venezuela. Some people would suggest other countries, but Russia certainly fits this description. And basically, the game of a new autocrat is not to kill people, because when you kill people, you signal that you have to kill people. That means that you're weak, you're incompetent, and your power is only based on the force, on the brutal force. While the current autocracy, the new autocracy, is based on information. They don't force people into accepting the autocracy. They try to convince people to like them. And in order to do that, they use massive propaganda. And I think we still underestimate the impact of today's propaganda in Russia. Russia, I think, goes beyond any historical precedents in terms of investing a lot of resources in making it effective and comprehensive. But on top of that, of course, Russia is not a closed country. There are many people who understand what's going on, and with those informed citizens, the regime has to deal with through other instruments, through cooptation, or bribes or material benefits, or through censorship. And the balance between these instruments is exactly what we consider and study in this paper. And going back to the issue of the fridge, I think the most important issue that we talk about in this paper is all these things cost money. And eventually the regime has to choose whether to spend on public goods, so people feel happier, or on information. And we show that eventually all these regimes will probably collapse at some point, but they may still survive for quite a while. And one surprising result that we find is these regimes may survive even when consumption levels are going down. And moreover, they can become even more popular along with falling living standards.
Is it possible that Putin very skillfully, after re-election 2012, began to shift the basis of regime's legitimacy from this constant growth in real incomes to what might be called patriotic mobilization?
I think you're exactly right, and we are trying to make this point in this academic paper as well. We argue that there are regimes which are actually switched to equilibria with co-optation and propaganda, and then there are regimes which are based on censorship and propaganda. And I think we saw as a Russian regime switched around this time, and you mentioned 2012, 2013, from one based on distributing, handing out the benefits of economic growth to the middle class, into becoming more censorship-based. And indeed, we are not really sure to what extent Crimean adventure or crisis started because Russian economy stopped to grow. Maybe it was just indeed an accident, but that was a very fortunate accident for Mr. Putin. If you actually go back to Mr. Nemtsov's analytical work on Ukrainian war, which was just published posthumously by his colleagues a few days ago, you can see that he starts with this electoral approval ratings of Mr. Putin, electoral ratings, which were sliding down as economic growth was sliding down. And that stagnation, or actually decline in ratings, was reversed by the Crimean adventure. And of course, even if it was an accident, that was a very nice coincidence for Mr. Putin to grab this accident and to use it to take advantage of this opportunity to grab somebody else's land to become more popular. I don't think it can go on, answering your question, I don't think it can go on for many, many years, but it certainly is possible that we will see a few years of this regime using the benefits of this territorial expansion.
Putin made this choice that he is willing to take the cost of sanctions because this perennial tension with Ukraine, this perennial tension with the West, gives him, I think, makes up in a certain way for the economic downturn. In terms of regime's legitimacy. Is that how you view it?
This is exactly the case. I think Mr. Putin made this conscious choice. He saw that economic growth is unlikely to return anyway, and so he used this foreign policy as an input for propaganda. He needs to explain to Russian public why incomes are falling, and having an enemy as big as the United States kind of explains why inflation is high and incomes are not growing. And if you compare that to previous foreign policy tensions, like things happening around Estonia or Poland or Georgia in early years of Putin's regime, these are not big enough to explain why incomes are not growing and actually are falling. If you actually say that this is the US, which is our enemy, that may explain quite a bit. However, I think we will see that the propaganda impact of annexing Crimea will fade away. And if Mr. Putin starts implementing Minsk II agreement, that will be a backlash in a sense that the public will see that he's weak and he's not competent. When he entered East Ukraine, he did not calculate to what extent sanctions can hurt. And I think this is something which will be very humiliating. Yet I can see how East Ukraine will be a frozen conflict at least. I don't see how it's completely abandoned by Mr. Putin. But I also attach zero probability to the event that Crimea will be returned to Ukraine under Mr. Putin's watch. I think it's unthinkable for Mr. Putin to return Crimea, and in that sense, I think some sanctions will stay. What can the West do? I think you rightly identified the battleground. I think the battleground is not actually in
Ukraine. It's in Russia, right?
It's in Russia, and it's in Russian television, in a sense. It's in Russian public's minds. It's the information war much more than it's a conventional war. And I think if the West wants to win hearts and minds of Russian public, the West has to speak to Russians and to explain why Mr. Putin is incompetent, why his policy is actually destroying Russia's future.
What happened to the to this upswelling of, for the lack of a better term, the middle class protest?
I think it was repressed. I think the right word is repression. I think the regime made a huge mistake because there was an opportunity to divest the non-democratic institutions and move slowly to the direction of democracy. And the regime went the other way, which means the regime destroyed its own exit options, which I think is very dangerous for the regime, and I can only be sorry for the top people in the government right now. But I think eventually democracy will come to Russia, and the very people that you mentioned, whether they are now in prison, under house arrest, outside of Russia, or whether they're temporarily accepting or believing Putin's propaganda, I think that will come back. Simply because you cannot stop march of history. You cannot, as President Lincoln once said, you can lie to some people forever, but for a long time you can deceive everybody, but for a short time, but you cannot deceive everybody forever.
How quickly can Russia replenish the reservoirs of social capital and public goods? This is something pretty precious, and it does not easily come back.
This is the key issue, and I think democracy cannot really exist and develop without trust from people, between people, without trust in institutions.
The point that Frank Fukuyama makes in the excellent book on trust.
Exactly. And I think we don't know. I think we see such an unprecedented attack on civil society, which is going on in Russia, mainly within people's heads. We don't have a precedent in history of such an aggressive and comprehensive propaganda. I think if we go back to 1930s in Germany, you can see Nazi radio, which has been extremely effective, but that was just audio. Now Russian TV, which is extremely well funded, also adds visuals. And I think humans are physiologically not able to be critically perceiving what they see on TV. If you see it in your own eyes, it's very hard for you to reject the notion that this is true. And I think humans are still to grow up and reject Putin's propaganda. I think that will take some time. And maybe the process of deep-brainwashing will take longer than we can expect.
You were a professor in Russia, and
Yes.
that matters because you were essentially in daily touch with, I think we could probably call them the Russian young elite. What do you think of them? I mean, where are they in all of this?
Well, in the New Economic School, the situation was indeed not representative. We built the school around meritocratic values. We fought cheating and plagiarism. We encouraged meritocracy and hard work, and people who prospered in that environment went on to meritocratic professional careers, either in Russia or in the West. But indeed, what you said is correct. I think there are several factors which have contributed to cynicism of the young generation, One is, of course, propaganda, which started in 2000s. Another thing is, of course, this propaganda was effective on the young generation because the young generation did not see how Soviet Union functioned.
So there's this mythological image.
Exactly. Nobody can believe that you couldn't actually buy whatever, sausage or toilet paper. And the young generation just doesn't understand to what extent Soviet Union collapsed because it was intrinsically incompetent and bankrupt. They would think that maybe there were some old incompetent people who, if trained well, they would run Soviet Union in the right way.
Or the plots by the West, right?
Or the plots by the West, exactly. And another thing is, of course, corruption, which prospers in Russian educational institutions. So when people in their formative years enter educational institutions, but if you look at surveys, you see that about half of Russian students actually encounter corruption firsthand. And when you're 18 to 24 years old, we know from psychological literature that's when you become a personality. And if at that age you understand that everything can be bought and sold, the shortcuts really work, principles don't really matter, then you become cynical, and that creates a new ground for corrupt practices later on. And I think this is the goal of the regime, to promote this feeling that Russia has no future without Putin's hierarchy, even though it's not actually working out that well. Basically, the message is if Putin is gone, there'll be no Russia.